Hey everyone, in today's video, I'm going to go over 5 easy steps to kind of walk through as you teach students new phonics concepts. Now, when I'm saying the term phonics concept for the examples in this video, it's going to relate to a sound that we're learning and the letter or letters that make that sound or represent that sound. So that's what I'm going to share in this video, but you can follow these same 5 steps to teach any phonics pattern. You could do it for a spelling pattern, like when we use C or when we use K. You could also do it for the floss rule, for example, that spelling pattern. I have a whole video on the floss rule right there. But basically you can walk through these same 5 steps whenever you are teaching your students a new concept. If you're ready to see what these 5 steps are, give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and let's get started. Alright, just to give a little background about where I got these 5 steps from, many of you already know that I am letters trained and I am also Orton Gillingham trained. I do also have my hands on the UFLI, the University of Florida Literacy Institute. I have my hands on their manual, their phonics manual, Foundations, which is great, by the way. So taking inspiration mainly from these resources and a few others, these 5 steps seem to be common among many, science of reading approved curriculums. So that is kind of where I got these 5 steps from. And at the end of this video, I'm also going to share a few honorable mentions or other little things you can do when introducing a new concept. All right, step number 1 is going to be some phonemic awareness practice. Now, I have a ton of videos sharing how I teach short vowels, how I teach digraphs, how I teach blends, how I teach long vowels, how I teach diphthongs, and many others. And in all of those videos, I walk through the steps of how I would teach that particular concept. So in this video, I'm going to go through the 5 steps I would do for any concept, so it'll be more generalized there. But what's common in those videos is I always like to start with the sound. I like to start with phonemic awareness practice. Now, sometimes I do that with my what's the rule slides. I've shared these numerous times, so I'm not going to spend too much time going into this, but here's an example with the ch or ch digraph. And basically I want students to figure out the rule, meaning what applies to all the words over on the left-hand side, the thumbs up side. And if that's the rule, it cannot apply on the thumbs down side. So as we say each of these words aloud, chips, chair, church, lunch, we can hear that we hear that ch sound. And then of course we'll go ahead and check if it is on the thumbs down side just to make sure and confirm that that is the rule. I have those slides for a ton of different phonics concepts, so I will link them down in the description. It is a really fun way to kind of kick off a lesson that's slightly different. But if you're looking for something a little more straightforward, you could also just use an alliterative sentence like this. This is a sentence I would use when teaching the short A sound, a, and I would ask my students to listen for the sounds they hear in this sentence. Adam and Abby had apples. I might repeat it a couple times, and then I would also say the images aloud. Apple, astronaut, axe, alligator. That is a slide I would display on the smartboard, and then again I would ask my students to listen to that sentence. They don't need to be able to read it at all. They're just listening to it. So that's like a teacher tool, right? So I'm saying the sentence aloud a few times, and then I'm pointing out each of the images and saying the image aloud. They can repeat it if they want, but I'm really wanting them to point out that they hear that ah sound quite a bit. Once my students point out that they are hearing that ah sound over and over, we say great, and we move to step 2. Step 2 is one that should never be skipped, and that is the explicit teaching of a new concept. So sticking with short A for our example, here is an example slide I would use with my students. I would say, let's learn a new sound, and I would point out the letter that's going to represent this sound. I would also take a minute to talk about the brev mark above the A here and how that represents that it is a short sound. And I would even tell them that guess what, later in the year we are going to learn another sound that this letter can make. I'd like to have a focus image on this slide, A for apple, and then we have our mouth formation. Now this is an important step you don't want to skip, and if your students have individual little hand mirrors that they keep in their phonics tools or in their desk somewhere, this is a great time to pull it out and for you to show them how to make that ah sound using this image as an example, using your own mouth, and then seeing that they can match it as they make that sound in their mirror. If you don't happen to have individual mirrors, you might want to get one per group and they can pass it around. You can also have students look at each other and make that ah sound, ah. This way you can have them check one another, and if you do it a couple times, it gives you a minute to kind of scan the room quickly and see if you need to do any redirection. After students have practiced that sound a few times, we move on to step 3, which is brainstorming words. Now this brainstorming part is a great time to connect students from the sound to words that they've either read or heard before in real life, for them to kind of understand that we're not just learning this, out of nowhere phonics concept. In fact, this phonics concept is used in our everyday words that we use all the time. When doing this, I like to use a simple slide like this one right here, where I will give some examples: at, apple, bat, cap, and note that I have that ah sound, and I will actually point this out to my students that sometimes we have it at the beginning of the word, at, apple, and sometimes I hear that ah in the middle of a word like b, at, or k, app, cap. After sharing those with my students, I will ask my students' whole group, what words do they know that have the sound ah in it? And now this is like a freestyle brainstorm, right? So I want to hear whatever my students are thinking. You might have them raise their hands, you might have them just call out. I'm trying to kind of rapidly gain a bunch of ideas. Now, as students give me words that correctly have the ah sound in it, I write them in the blue box on this slide. Now, if students give a word that does not have the ah sound, that might be a little confusing for them, like for example, the word acorn. Students might know acorn has an A in it, and that looks like the letter that we just learned, but it doesn't have that ah sound. I don't usually tell them right away that that's incorrect. What I do instead is I say, acorn. That sounds a little different to me. Let me write it over here on the side. And then I would actually go ahead and write that word on the side or somewhere else, but I wouldn't put it in the blue box or whatever box you've determined that is correct, right? Then after a quick brainstorming session, whatever words were not in them, we kind of go through them quickly. And during this time, I will actually just simply point out to students, hey, let's look at this word acorn. I noticed that it has an A in it, just like our ah words, but it makes a different sound. That sound is one we're actually gonna learn later, and then we can erase it, right? So we're sticking to ah. So step 3 is brainstorm some words. Step 4 when teaching a new phonics concept is letter formation. Now this is going to be particularly important in kindergarten and first grade. As you move on to second grade and some of those concepts include letters that students have already learned, this step may be removed, and it can kind of be on a class by class basis. If you feel like your class as a whole needs work on letter formation, then this would be a step to keep in. So if you are learning about the suffix ing at the end of a word, you might want to have them practice that ing letter formation. If you feel like most of your students don't need it, skip this step and do that in small group instead. But for kindergarten and first grade, this is definitely a step we want to keep in. When teaching letter formation, I like to have my students put their hands in the air and we practice some skywriting. So over on the right, I have some handwriting lines, and I will go ahead and explain the steps of creating an A. I will explain exactly how to do it, and then I will have students skywrite it a few times in the air. After students have practiced making this letter in the air, this is a great time for them to do some tactile instruction. You might want to have them take out their whiteboards and some expo markers and have them practice making that letter correctly. You might want to have them use sand boards or gel boards. You might want to use sandpaper, whatever works for you, but you want students to correctly form that letter a bunch of times. And when I say a bunch, I mean at least 3, but maybe closer to like 5 or 7. So have them really form and make that letter correctly, repeating the steps that you just said. All right, so at this point, students have practiced phonemic awareness. They have explicitly learned the new concept as well as how to make that sound with their mouth. They have practiced brainstorming words with that sound, connecting their prior knowledge, and they've practiced actual letter formation. The last step I like to take with them is a quick visual discrimination task that looks like this. Here I would simply throw up a small grid, and I would just ask students to find and highlight the letter that makes the ah sound, or whatever concept you're working on. This is kind of like a quick little review at the end of our introductory lesson, just to have students really identify that letter with others that might look similar. To do this, I would simply call students one by one. They would find the letter on the board, circle it or highlight it, and then I would ask them what sound it's making for this particular phonics skill. So they would find an A, circle it, and say ah. So those are the 5 main steps I follow when teaching a new phonics concept or skill. Now I do have some other steps that I mentioned earlier that I do want to share with you, but before I do that, let me quickly just run through those 5 steps so they're all written right here. Number 1 is phonemic awareness practice, where students are listening for that sound. Number 2 is the explicit teaching of the skill. Number 3 is brainstorming the words with the class. Number 4 is teaching students letter formation. And number 5 is visual discrimination. Now, if you've watched any of my other phonics videos that I mentioned earlier, like my how to teach CVC words or how to teach words with silent E, you will know that my next steps usually involve games and review centers and things like that. And that's definitely what I would do next, but this video is focused on just the whole group introduction of a concept. So these other little extra steps I'm gonna share right now would also be ones you would introduce whole group. They wouldn't be kind of moving on to that next step. If you wanna see more about that, go to those particular videos. All right, the first bonus step is one I would do during step 2 when you are explicitly teaching that new concept, and that would be to actually physically bring in an object that has that sound. I would do this before the brainstorming, but I like to bring in something that students can actually hold. So if our focus skill is I'd probably bring in a real apple. I would have students pass it around, apple. Give them that tactile and memorable experience of holding it. If you were doing Q-U, you might bring in a quilt. If you had a real quilt that students could touch and feel and think about, it helps them remember and make a connection with that sound. If you don't have something you could physically bring in, you could also share a photograph of something in real life. Again, we want to make connections here with students' prior knowledge, so you could do pictures of an apple, you could do pictures of a quilt, but I do find that if it's something tactile that you can pass around, it creates a little bit better memory. Another bonus step would be to include a literature connection, so to read a story or a short poem that really highlights that sound. Now, unlike an alliterative sentence that we would pick very carefully, a literature connection, since it's a real text that is, made with all sorts of different words, it wouldn't be best for the phonemic awareness part at the beginning, but you could use this at the end, maybe after the visual discrimination or in place of it, where you share a couple pages of a story that have that sound in it. And as you read the story, you can have students give a simple thumbs up whenever they hear that sound. Now, of course, I wouldn't do that for an entire story. Your students are likely to miss quite a few, and that's a little bit taxing, but maybe the first or second page, you could slowly read it with the goal of them listening for the target sound. For the example of short A, you could read a story like The Cat in the Hat, or a Johnny Appleseed story, using words that you've already brainstormed, so they're really listening for those target words, and they get to hear them over and over again and know that cat has short A, and apple has short A. And another bonus step you may want to use is to include a gesture. And now I would do this step also with step 2, the explicit teaching. I know there are some phonics programs like Foundations that always have a gesture, especially with their short vowels. So they might say, octopus, or up, just to give them some movement and a gesture that helps them remember that sound. So if you are going to include a gesture, I would recommend including it in step 2. All right, so there are the 5 main steps, as well as some bonus ones that I use when teaching brand new phonics skills whole group to my students. I do want to let you know that I have those 5 slides, so each of the 5 steps. I actually have them. They are in the SGT Literacy Club right now, but I do plan on putting them on TPT, so by the time this video is out, I will have them linked down below. Right now, there are only slides for the 26 letters of the alphabet, and they do follow a specific scope and sequence that is shared within the unit, but I do plan to expand these slides to include digraphs, long vowels, diphthongs, and all sorts of other phonics skills that you would teach in your K-2 classroom. If you want to check those out, they will be linked down below. Before I end this video, I would love to know from you if there are any steps you think I missed or steps that you include in your classroom that work really well for your students. Let us know in the comments down below. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up so I know. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel and click that bell. That way you're notified of every new video. See you in the next one. Bye.